You're watching Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Julia Kim. Our top stories this hour. Senegal's President Macky Sall says that Russia is ready to export grain to Africa amid a looming global food crisis sparked by the Ukraine war. Sudan marks the 3-year anniversary of the June 3rd massacre. 128 protesters were killed by security forces, but despite an investigation, no one has been charged for the atrocities. And France 24 gets an exclusive first look at a UN report detailing the rapid unravelling of Mali's desperate security situation. It also describes the exponential rise in fatalities and other abuses linked to the Malian army. But first, the head of the African Union, Senegalese President Macky Sall, says he's happy and reassured after talks in Russia with President Vladimir Putin. Sall told Putin that African countries were indirect victims of the war in Ukraine, which has sparked a food crisis on the continent. Well, following his meeting in Sochi, Sall appealed to the West to ease their sanctions on Russia. Take a listen.
Russia must also be able to export fertilizers and food products, mainly cereals, since it's the country that exports the most cereals. Obviously, these requests are incompatible with sanctions. That's why we decided after this exchange to appeal to Western partners. I also salute the American position on this matter, as they lifted the sanctions regarding food, provisions and fertilizer.
Well, fears of a global food crisis have hit Africa particularly hard due to its dependence on wheat from Ukraine and Russia. Western sanctions on Moscow, as well as blockaded ports in Ukraine, have disrupted deliveries, leaving millions on the continent facing extreme hunger. Catherine Viette tells us more.
Famine is looming in the Horn of Africa, as more than 23 million people are experiencing extreme hunger. According to Oxfam and Save the Children, these numbers represent just those living in Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya, an increase of 10 million from 2021. Several factors have contributed to the crisis, including an ongoing drought and the pandemic, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine has made the situation worse. According to the UN, between 2018 and 2020, African countries imported 44% of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine. But now those shipments have all but dried up, due in part to Russia's blockade of Ukrainian ports, preventing Kyiv from exporting its grain. Prices of wheat on the African continent have already increased by 45%, according to the African Development Bank, making the cost of basic food items more expensive and potentially out of reach for millions. The bank is also warning of a possible 20% decline in food production because farmers have seen the cost of imported fertilizer rise by 300%. Africa's reliance on Russia was demonstrated at a UN meeting in March. Most members voted to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The one continent that was conspicuous in not doing so was Africa. 17 African countries abstained, while another 8 chose not to participate at all. The fear of Russian reprisals was clear to see. For its part, Moscow blames Western sanctions for the food crisis. Officials from the UN have been holding talks with Russia to release blocked wheat reserves. Failure to reach an agreement could be devastating for the African continent.
Let's turn now to Sudan, where a protester has been shot dead in the capital, Khartoum, as the country marks 3 years since the day pro-democracy protesters were massacred by security forces. Thousands of people across the country took to the streets to demand justice for the 128 victims who were killed during a peaceful sit-in against the now ousted dictator Omar al-Bashir. An investigation has so far yielded no arrests. France 24's Jean-Emile Jamin tells us more.
Sudan, a fragile state teetering on the edge of a crisis, and where people still cry out for justice 3 years on from one of its deadliest massacres. June 3rd, 2019, central Khartoum. It's been 2 months since long-serving dictator Omar al-Bashir was overthrown as president in a coup. The Transitional Military Council has assumed power, But protesters at this sit-in are calling for an unconditional return to civilian rule. A barrage of bullets rains down as security forces try to dispel the demonstrations. Over 120 people are killed, some of their bodies thrown into the Nile, while doctors report scores of rapes committed by paramilitary personnel. Several months later, a joint civilian-military government is in charge, led by Sudan's new Prime Minister, Abdallah Hamdok. He has tasked a fact-finding committee to uncover the truth about the June killings, while aiming to bring the perpetrators to justice. 3,000 witness testimonies are subsequently heard, while military members are questioned in person. But the pandemic delays proceedings, and over time the investigation goes cold. Then in October 2021, Sudan's brief glimpse of democracy comes to a crashing halt, as the military seizes power from the transitional government. Hamdok is arrested, along with several other officials, with the country's top general Abdel Fattah al-Burhan taking control.
To correct the path of the revolution, we decided to implement a state of emergency across the country.
On the 9th of March this year, security forces raid the offices of the June 3rd Investigation Committee, just 2 days after it suspended all activities. Now, as the country commemorates the 3rd anniversary of the killings, protesters have rallied on the streets once again, demanding accountability.
We will continue our struggle and we will not stop. We have brothers who died, we have martyrs, we have victims, and we will not give up our rights to Burhan.
All the while, the search for justice continues in Sudan.
Now, 2 United Nations peacekeepers have been killed and 2 others injured after an improvised bomb exploded in central Mali. Now, the soldiers were part of one of the United Nations' most dangerous peacekeeping missions, MINUSMA. It was established back in 2013 to stabilize Mali after extremists took over swathes of the country. Well, today, an exclusive copy of a UN report has been seen by France 24, detailing the critical situation in the West African nation. France 24's Jihadi Movements expert Wassim Nasser has more.
We learned, for example, that today we have like 12,261 military of the MINUSMA deployed in Mali, 1,718 policemen, and 1,833 civilians from more than 60 countries. And here we see the map. We cannot see the details, but we see the scope of the deployment of the MINUSMA there. We learned also that the MINUSMA is still conducting joint patrols with the reconstituted Malian army with factions of the north in areas like Gao, Tombouctou, left by the French, and also Kidal, knowing that the day before yesterday, the MINUSMA lost one of its Jordanians military in a much elaborated attack in Kidal. And we didn't know that still the MINUSMA is operating in such dangerous areas. We got to know also that they are operating in the center, hand in hand with local authorities, but also with the Malian army. And we got to know also that they are very critical about the political situation, knowing that they expressed the fears that northern factions have, or the signatory factions had, regarding what Bamako is projecting for the north after the departure of the French. We got to know also that the United Nations forces got many obstructions on their action by the Malian authorities, for example, and that, for example, Malian authorities control only 15% of the territory. Down to 10% in the north and down 21% in the center, which means that the situation is very, very critical in this assessment.
And finally, 300 Central African refugees living in eastern Cameroon have been repatriated as part of a voluntary deportation scheme organised by the United Nations. This is the first such repatriation since the outbreak of the pandemic and comes amid an uneasy peace in the Central African Republic. Our team on the ground sent us this report from a refugee settlement in Bado Badzere.
This refugee settlement in eastern Cameroon is home to over 30,000 Central African refugees, a majority of them children. It was set up in 2014 to host the refugees fleeing war in their country. Today is a big day for this family. 4 years since they arrived here. They fled the Central African Republic following violence between armed groups that erupted in the country in 2018. They are excited to return home, although parts of the country are still controlled by rebels. They told us that they are motivated by the calm that has reigned in the capital Bangui for several months now.
I'm happy to return because life was getting difficult for us here. The situation is not completely stable, but we have learned that peace is returning. My parents are sick in the Central African Republic, and I have to go to be with them.
The family is part of 300 refugees benefiting from a voluntary repatriation agreement that was signed in 2019 by the Central African Republic, the UNHCR and Cameroon, represented at this ceremony by the Interior Minister.
The departure must be voluntary and secure. We already organized 3 voluntary repatriations. We did it in 2018, 2019 and 2020. We had to stop because the coronavirus made it impossible for us to continue.
Since 2019, over 5,000 people have benefited from the program. Like every returnee, this family representative receives some essential supplies, just enough to get by for a few days. They then board one of 3 buses hired by the UNHCR for the journey. The returnees are caught between uncertainty about the future and hope for a new beginning.
I have family and friends in Bangui who are waiting for my return. While in Cameroon, I was trained in masonry. When I arrive in Bangui, I'll be able to put it into practice and maybe make a living.
30 minutes later, they arrive at the border between Cameroon and the Central African Republic. The refugees are officially handed over to Central African authorities. Across the border, these returnees will start a new life on this transit site before reuniting with their families. In the meantime, over 350,000 Central Africans are still refugees in Cameroon.
Well, that's it from us here on Eye on Africa. There's more world news coming up next with France 24's Monty Francis. Stay with us.
In 2017, nearly 900,000 Rohingyas, a Muslim minority brutally repressed by Myanmar, fled to refugee camps in Cox's Bazar in the south of neighbouring Bangladesh, where living conditions are becoming ever harsher. Faced with the overcrowding of the camps, the Bangladesh government has decided to move some of the refugees to Basan Char, a remote outpost that resembles a prison island.
আমরা সবাই জানি যে যখনই অন্য দেশের কেউ এরকম রিফিউজি বা ডিসপ্লেসড হয়ে আসে তাকে কিন্তু সেই দেশের মধ্যে ফ্রিলি মুভমেন্ট করতে দেয়া হয় না.
Watch Reporters, the eternal exile of the Rohingyas, on France 24 and France24.com.